Mark chapter 1, verse 2 is pretty straightforward in terms of Greek, but the really interesting discussion is why he says this citation is from Isaiah, when in fact it's from Malachi, Exodus, and Isaiah. And then connected to that is the whole text critical question of how in the Textus Receptus do we get to saying in the prophets and not Isaiah specifically. Kathos kegraptai ento Isaiah to prophete idu apostello tan angelanmu prasopusu has katiskiwase ten hadansu. Just as it has been written, right? Perfect passive of grapho. So it's either it has been written or it stands written versus it is written in the Isaiah. Now, what's unusual is that you have an article inside a prepositional phrase, but the emphasis is certainly on the fact that it's the Isaiah that Mark is talking about, the prophet. So you could say in the prophet Isaiah or in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I send or I am sending my messenger. Remember, angelos can be messenger or a specific type of messenger, namely an angel, but my messenger before your face. So this is going to be John the Baptist going before Jesus. And then the relative clause, who will prepare, right? There's your future. Who will prepare your way? Now, one of the things that's really interesting in this passage is the reference to Isaiah, because guess what? While the next verse, verse 3, is from Isaiah 40, verse 3, this first part, or verse 2, is actually primarily drawn from Malachi 3:1, possible references also to Exodus 23:20. So what's going on? Well, this is a great example of how biblical New Testament writers were comfortable taking prophecies from different locations and seeing that they go together, maybe not historically, but there's something else that's tying them all together. And certainly that's the case here. And as to whether you want to quote Malachi or Isaiah, Isaiah is much more the preeminent prophet, and so probably his name gets included. But when you put those three prophecies together, it's interesting. They all have to do with God's protection of his people. So in Exodus 23:20, it's a promise to keep Israel safe as they go out in their exodus. In Isaiah 43, it's the promise that they will return from exile and God will be with them. And then in Malachi 3:1, it's the prophecy of the coming of John the Baptist and the preparation for the final exodus, as it were, and God's provision for them. So all three of these have to do with God's provision relative to exodus and exile, and Mark puts them together into a singular prophecy because they are joined together theologically. This does explain also the King James variant, which says, just as it was written in the prophets. The textual evidence for Isaiah being listed specifically and not the prophets in general is much stronger. There's no question in terms of the text and external criticism that Mark wrote Isaiah. But you also have the basic rule of the more difficult reading, or which reading would give rise to another. Is it more conceivable that the scribes would see Isaiah and change it to the prophets to take care of this problem of Malachi, Exodus, and Isaiah? Or is it more likely that Mark would have written the prophets and a scribe changed it to Isaiah and introduced this problem? Well, of course, it's much more likely that Isaiah was original and a later scribe wanted to deal with the problem and so changed it to the prophets. In terms of phrasing, this is the first example of poetry that we've looked at. And so you most likely are going to just want to stick it into its different stanzas. Going to have to make it a little smaller so that you can get everything on the page. But most likely what you just do is you have the introductory statement and then indent the first line of poetry and indent the second line of poetry. And you probably would want to connect the relative pronoun back to its antecedent. The other way, of course, you could do it is that you could take the relative clause and indent it under angelan, but I like to keep the structure of the poetry clear.